Imagine waking up to a world where the global energy supply is suddenly cut off and a decades-long diplomatic standoff has finally reached its breaking point. For years, the international community has watched a high-stakes game of chess between Washington and Tehran, defined by sanctions, threats, and temporary deals. But recently, that game changed. Donald Trump's approach to this conflict isn't just about a single strike or a political disagreement. It's driven by a specific worldview, a belief that historical patterns are repeating themselves and that the window to act is closing. He sees this not as a new war, but as a final attempt to correct a 30-year-old strategic mistake. To understand why the situation has escalated so rapidly now, we have to look at how the American leadership views the concept of nuclear patience and what they believe happens when diplomacy is used as a shield rather than a solution. Before we dive into the details of this strategy and what it means for the future of the Middle East, if you find this kind of deep dive analysis helpful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue creating well-researched content like this. Now, let's look at the logic behind the Single Sting Doctrine. The core of Trump's perspective lies in what his advisors call the Single Sting Doctrine. Essentially, he refuses to let the United States be caught in the same trap twice. In his view, Iran is following a blueprint established decades ago by North Korea. Back in the 1990s, North Korea engaged in lengthy negotiations, signed agreements, and promised to halt its nuclear ambitions in exchange for aid and eased sanctions. However, while the world was focused on the paperwork, Pyongyang was busy building the infrastructure for its nuclear arsenal. Today, they are a nuclear power. Trump views Iran's recent diplomatic maneuvers as a modern, more sophisticated version of that same nuclear smokescreen, a way to buy time while moving closer to the ultimate goal. He sees the collapse of the 2026 negotiations not as a failure of diplomacy, but as a confirmation that the process was never intended to succeed in the first place. This brings us to the question of timing. Why now? In early 2026, after a series of high-level talks failed to produce a breakthrough, the American administration reached a conclusion. Time was no longer on their side. They believed that Persian procrastination, a term used to describe Tehran's talent for long-term negotiation, was being used as a strategic weapon. From Washington's perspective, every month spent talking was another month Iran spent perfecting its delivery systems. Trump's decision to move toward a more aggressive stance was an attempt to break the clock before Tehran could complete a functional nuclear warhead. However, the nuclear issue wasn't the only factor. The decision to escalate was also triggered by what Trump described as global blackmail. When Iran moved to exert more control over the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a huge portion of the world's oil passes, it wasn't just a regional move, it was a direct threat to the global economy. In Trump's analytical framework, allowing a country to hold the world's energy supply hostage while simultaneously developing nuclear weapons is a recipe for a global catastrophe that cannot be contained. He viewed the closure of the strait as an act of economic warfare that required a decisive response to prevent a total collapse of international markets. But the strategy behind the current military actions is different from previous conflicts. It's what analysts call the Bridges and Energy Day strategy. To understand this, we have to compare Iran to North Korea. North Korea is a highly isolated society where the population has endured decades of extreme poverty and famine. In such a system, the leadership is less vulnerable to internal pressure because the people have very little to lose. Trump's team views Iran differently. They see a modern, connected society with a middle class that has grown accustomed to technology, infrastructure, and international trade. The American strategy focuses on hitting socially vital targets, bridges, power plants, and water treatment facilities. The logic here is simple cause and effect. By disrupting the comforts of modern life, the pressure on the government doesn't just come from outside, it comes from within. The goal is to force the leadership to choose between their regional ambitions and the total internal collapse of their country. The gamble is that the Iranian people, unlike the North Koreans, will not accept a return to what Trump calls the Stone Age. There is also a shift in how the US views the concept of deterrence. In the past, any military action against a nuclear-capable or near-nuclear state was held back by the fear of immediate catastrophic retaliation. For years, the US has been hesitant to act against North Korea because of the proximity of Seoul, the South Korean capital. Seoul is so close to the border that it is essentially a hostage to North Korean artillery. However, in the 2026 context, Trump's administration argues that Iran lacks this kind of suicide deterrence. While Iran has regional proxies, it does not have a major pro-Western metropolis within its immediate artillery range in the same way North Korea does. From Trump's perspective, the cost of striking now, damaging ports and infrastructure, is high, but it is manageable. He compares it to a one-time insurance payment. In his view, paying the cost of a strike today is far better than living under a nuclear ghost that would dominate the Persian Gulf forever. He believes that once a nation achieves nuclear status, the window for conventional military influence closes entirely, and the US would be forced into a permanent state of strategic retreat in the region. This leads us to the final goal of this current policy. Unlike previous administrations that sought to freeze Iran's nuclear program or change its behavior through incremental pressure, the current vision is about total dismantling. The objective is no longer a temporary pause or a better deal. It is the complete removal of the nuclear infrastructure, the long-range missile program, and regional influence networks. Trump's approach is built on the belief that diplomacy only works when the alternative is unthinkable. He views the language of fire as the only tool left to force the pragmatic elements within the Iranian government to make a hard choice: total compliance or total destruction. He isn't looking for a compromise. He's looking for a conclusion. He believes that the era of strategic patience has only served to make the eventual confrontation more dangerous, and by forcing the issue now, he is attempting to dictate the terms of the final outcome. It is a high-stakes strategy that relies on the assumption that the Iranian system will crack under pressure rather than explode outward. It assumes that the global economy can withstand the short-term shock of a conflict in exchange for the long-term stability of a non-nuclear Middle East. It is a vision of the world where American power is used to preemptively break threats before they become unmanageable, regardless of the traditional diplomatic norms that have governed the last 30 years. As we watch these events unfold, we have to ask ourselves about the long-term consequences of this all-or-nothing approach. If the goal is to end the cycle of tension once and for all, will this strategy lead to a new era of stability, or will it create a vacuum that leads to even greater unpredictability? Donald Trump's vision for this war is clear. He sees it as a necessary correction to prevent a future he believes is inevitable if the US remains passive. But in a region as complex as the Middle East, outcomes are rarely as predictable as the strategic memo suggests. This brings us to a question for you. Do you believe that a decisive strike strategy can actually bring long-term peace to a region, or does it simply plant the seeds for the next major conflict? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We look forward to reading your perspectives.